William, after the city of Jinns, The Last Mughal, and the Wolfson Prize winner White Mughals, your latest book, The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company, sits in the middle of the end of the great period of the Mughal Empire and start of the Raj. What compelled you to write about this period?
So everyone in India knows about the great Mughals, about Shah Jahan and the Taj Mahal. Everyone knows about Lord Curzon and the Raj and Queen Victoria and all that stuff. But in between those periods, you have this extraordinary world which breaks all our expectations. It's a world where it isn't the British Empire, which is, or Britain, which is running India, but one multinational corporation, the first multinational corporation, the East India Company, which was not initially in any way involved with the government. For the first 170 years, from about 1600 through to 1770, it was this kind of completely libertarian, ruthless capitalist organization, which performed the hugely improbable feat of taking over the richest empire in the world. And when it started, just to give you the context for this, Britain was producing about 3% of world GDP in 1599, which was the year the company started, the same year, to give you a bit of context, that Shakespeare was writing Hamlet. And at that period, the Mughal Empire was producing about 37.6% of world GDP. In other words, well over a third of world GDP. And for the first time in Indian history, India, by which I mean most of modern India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and most of Afghanistan, which was what made up the Mughal Empire, that area, for the first time in history, had overtaken China as the world's leading industrial producer. I think today in India there's a tendency to see the Mughals as these effete kings building ridiculously expensive tombs and sort of poncing around in sort of Bollywood outfits. In actual fact, the Mughals, I mean, it's seen from the point of view of economic history, were the most successful Indian dynasty of all. And in the early 18th century, just when politically the Mughal Empire was, in a sense, beginning to fracture, the economic power of the Mughals was at its peak, largely due to the textile industry in Bengal. And by Bengal, I mean the greater Bengal, which embraces not only modern Bangladesh, but Orissa and Bihar. And that area was the world's manufacturing hub of textiles in the 18th century, in the same way that Manchester became a century later in the 19th century. 1 million weavers at work, producing not just incredibly high quality and cheap and competitive cotton, but chintzes, kalamkaris, incredibly fine silks, weaves so fine they were called baftawa, woven air. And this was incredibly competitive and remarkable industrial produce that conquered not just Europe. Every Frenchman, every Dutchman wanted a kalamkari hanging on his bed or around his bed as a four-poster. But also further afield, for example, there's deindustrialization as far away as Mexico due to the quantities of incredibly high-quality cotton being produced by the Mughals. And the East India Company initially rises up as basically the shippers of this material around the world. And they are, you could see it in them as parasitic or symbiotic with the rise of Mughal industrial power. So this was a period when India was unbelievably wealthy. Millions of pounds in weight of British and European gold and silver is pouring, not just from Britain, but from Portugal, from Holland, and from Denmark. All these countries have their bases up and down the Hooghly and up and down the east coast of India. And they're pouring their gold and silver into India. And it seems right up until the mid-18th century that this is a loss of gold bullion to Europe and a gain to India that is irreversible. And this has been something which has been the case in Indian history since the time of Pliny. And if you read Pliny in the 1st century, he complains, very austere Roman writer, contemporary with Jesus and Augustus, who complains that such is the decadence of Roman womanhood that all they want to do is wrap themselves in gorgeous silks, rub their bodies with sandalwood paste from India, and to hang their ears Indian diamonds, which is then an exclusively Indian purchase. So the idea that we are now seeing ahead of us of India as this big industrial growing power with an incredible future is not something new and odd and surprising. It's just a reversal to what has always been the case, and only stopped being the case due to European firepower in this very brief period between sort of Vasco da Gama in the 1490s and I suppose the 1947. 500 years breaking what had otherwise been 3,000 years of economic dominance by China and India.